know whether to tell whether anybody can hear me or not. I don't know if anybody can type in the chat window or anything.
Chris, I can hear you.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to take that to mean that everybody can hear me. Maybe I'll just end up talking to Kenneth. I'm not sure. So do I have control of the presentation now, Kenneth?
Yes, you do.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, assuming anybody out there can hear me, and if you want to send me an email or show something in the chat window to confirm that that's the case, I'm going to just proceed as if everybody out there can hear me. I appreciate your patience and sticking with us. It's shown that we got 77 attendees, which is better than the 26 we were limited to before, and impressive given the technical difficulties that Kenneth and I were trying to work through for the past few minutes. But I do appreciate everybody joining us today to talk about the fiscal year 15, fiscal year 16 revenue projections memo that came out last week. Hopefully you all had a chance to look it over or I don't know, at least look at the charts or look at the summaries that were put together as part of that. It was a difficult memo to put together just because there's a lot of uncertainty out there, a lot of questions about the different revenue sources. But without belaboring that point, and I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it. And you can email me or Kenneth. I don't know. Are you? Do you have a procedure in case anybody wants to ask questions? Are they going to be able to do it over the phone, or should they email one of us or chat box? What do you think?
Yeah, if you will go use the chat box, that's probably the best way for us to take questions at this time.
I'll try to keep an eye on my email if your chat isn't working for any reason. But yeah, if you can, put any questions you have in the chat box while we're going through it, let me know. Again, thank you all for joining us. I appreciate your interest. And I'll just move right into it, assuming I can control the presentation like I think I can. So what you'll see in front of you on the screen now, hopefully, is that that summary chart of all the different local revenue sources. And I'll go through and talk about each one of them in a little bit more detail as we go through the remainder of the conference call. You know, I think, especially in terms of local sales tax, you know, I think it's a generally positive memo and a positive revenue projection. Of course, I referenced the uncertainty that's out there, and I'll touch on that again a little bit later. I know that there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of reasons to not be as positive about your revenues as you might otherwise, despite it being a relatively positive economic scenario. I know I saw, this always tends to happen. I put the memo out last Thursday and then saw some articles over the weekend about how the first quarter economy is slowing down a little bit, and there might be less reason for optimism than there was just a few weeks ago. Hopefully some of that is weather related and just temporary and reflects what happened in 2003, where the first quarter was a little bit slower and then the economy picked back up after that. It's one reason I chose to go a little bit conservative on the sales tax projections for the coming year, even though a lot of people are talking 5% or better growth in sales tax going forward. But you know, with a few exceptions in there, I think you know, where the bulk of the revenues are is generally going to be pretty positive moving forward, and a lot of the economic indicators we have thus far seem to be good overall. It's you know, as always, and you hear this reflected at the legislature and in different conversations, some areas geographically are more positive than others. Certainly some of the urban areas are doing better than some of the rural areas are, and that's just a fact, and that's why we always have those caveats in there about taking your local considerations into account, because you know what's happening on the ground in your area better than I do or anybody at the state level making these kind of projections do, certainly. But you know, I do think by and large everything is looking up, just in a very general sense. This chart that we try to always include in the revenue memo sort of reflects that, comparing taxable sales from 07, 08 to the present day. You can see that everything, you know, all the other category, everything but construction, reached pre-recession levels a few years ago, a couple, 3 years ago, and continues to trend upward. It's really in that construction-related area where we haven't seen the growth back to pre-recession levels that we have in all the other areas of sales. And construction is an indicator for a lot of different reasons that I get into if you actually read the narrative in the memo that we put together. Ever since we put that summary chart together, I don't know how many people actually go through and read the whole thing, and I don't necessarily blame you. I know you're looking for the numbers that you can plug in, but with construction being such an indicator for sales tax, all the sales taxes paid on construction materials, it affects your solid waste tax. It's just a general indicator of the economy. We still haven't seen it, like I said, get back to where it was before the recession. It's continued to generally trend upward, although just more slowly than I think anybody had hoped. Coming out of the recession. So I think when we did this memo in 2014, last year at this time, it was sort of the same type of thing. It was slowly creeping up throughout the year and then just leveled off heading into 2014. Some of that might be weather, some of that might be something else. I'm not sure exactly. But 2015, I think you're probably seeing something similar. We saw slow if steady growth for most of 2014. A little bit of leveling off heading into 2015, but again, hopefully some of that is just weather related and just sort of a time factor, and is not going to be reflected necessarily for the remainder of the year. Talking about another table that we try to have in there, just to give you an idea of activity and prices. You can see there right around 07, 08, 09, the sharp decrease in single-family housing permits. Prices, at least in the Charlotte area, which is the only metro area that we have one of these indicators for, which is why we use the Charlotte MSA, never fell quite as sharply as the permits did overall. We've seen a couple hiccups along the way, but again, the permits seem to be picking back up. Last year maybe didn't grow quite as quickly as the past 2 years before, but we're seeing that growth. Home prices have remained strong. They're headed up again, headed into 2015. Just another reason, again, that we think that as a whole, North Carolina is looking strong heading into the next year. Construction and housing are certainly not the only indicators of that, but they're one of the key ones that we certainly, when we look at going ahead, a lot of different forecasts to peg employment and a lot of different other factors to continue to increase in the year ahead. So it's slower growth than I think everybody hoped coming out of the recession, but there does appear to be growth. Always some factors to worry about on the horizon. Can energy prices stay this low? Are wages going to keep up with job growth? Those sorts of things. What's going to happen with the U.S. dollar and interest rates? But again, we're kind of in line with most of the other folks that do this sorts of thing, and hoping that the economy in general is going to stay strong. It's just up to you all to know what a strong economy exactly means for your local situation and how that might be reflected in your particular local situation. Caveats before I start this. I think these are in the memo, and I'm going to add one that I didn't get a chance to update the slide before we started the presentation. I guess saying that projections are rough estimates is sort of self-evident, and that kind of goes without saying. I think you know that we do our best to look forward and predict what's going to happen, but again, I'm just going to stress the importance of adapting this to what's happening locally. Keeping up with the weekly legislative updates, and if you don't get our weekly legislative bulletin, feel free to go ahead and email me, cnida@nclm.org. I'll get you added to our mailing list to make sure you get our update every Friday. While the legislature's in session, and even while it's out of session, we always have something on Friday telling you what's been happening in Raleigh, what people are talking about. While it's in session, it's update on bills that have been filed, bills that have been voted on, bills that are going to pass or not going to pass, whatever might be happening, whatever we know and they're able to share at least, we get that out every Friday. And quite frankly, I think we do a better, I'll just say a better and a more comprehensive job than just about any other organization that's doing this in Raleigh. So, in terms of getting a comprehensive look at what's happening with local legislation, I like to think there's no better place to go than the league. That leads me to my other caveat, which is everything that is in the revenue memo, with the exception of maybe the POW bill funds, just because they just passed a bill on that, all of this assumes that there's not going to be any legislative change to revenue streams for fiscal year 15-16. I put this together based on, the situation as we know it now, and I know there's a lot of ideas out there, a lot of talk about what may or may not be done to local revenue streams, to your local revenue picture, and I'm happy to answer questions about that at the end of the presentation. But again, what's the projections that are made in there assume that there's not going to be any legislative changes passed. And I think I wrote this in the memo or something to this effect at least. That's not a prediction. That's not any kind of commentary on the legislation that's been filed. I don't have a crystal ball and can't tell you whether something is going to pass or is not going to pass. But again, just for the purposes of this memo, it assumes that there's going to be no legislative changes for 15-16, and we'll certainly keep you updated and revise this memo, or at least get an email out to everybody and let you know if that changes and how those changes might affect what we talk about today and talk about in the memo. So with that, I'm just going to talk about a little bit of the a couple of the revenue areas, at least in a lot of depth, and then talk about some more than others, and then certainly answer any questions that you have. I see some of you are using the chat box already. Again, you can email me too. I'll keep an eye on my email. I'm sure Kenneth can pass along questions as well. But to start off talking about local sales tax, we have seen significant growth in the first part of this fiscal year. I think for the state overall, I believe it was 12.4% growth the first 6 months of 14-15 as compared to the first 6 months of 13-14. So, sales are strong, the economy is strong. Sales tax is one of the bright spots at the state level. You look at the state revenue picture and how revenues haven't quite met the projections that the state revenue forecasters have put together for the state budget. One of the things keeping it from being any worse at the state level, quite frankly, is the performance of sales tax. Sales tax is up even higher than folks expected at the state level, and certainly up at the local level, higher than what we had projected for this fiscal year. That said, not to be a complete buzzkill, but I have reason to suspect that this level of growth that we've seen thus far is not going to hold up for the entire fiscal year. And I think the main reason for that, even aside from the weather or kind of slowdowns in the economy from the winter or whatever it might be, we had some sales tax base expansion when the legislature did tax reform in 2013. It wasn't a huge base expansion. I'm trying to think offhand. There was some sales tax applied to movie tickets and amusements, concert tickets, other sorts of things. Maybe not warranties, but maybe service contracts or some kind of ongoing agreements for maintenance, those sorts of things that you get with cars or other large purchases. So not a huge base expansion, but there was some base expansion, and that all went into effect January 1st of 2014. So there's reason to believe that at least some of the growth that we've seen in this first 6 months as compared to the last 6 months is related to that base expansion going into effect, which is why, if you go back and check the chart, I projected about 7.5% growth overall from 13-14 to the end of this year, 14-15. Still very strong growth, stronger than what we had even predicted last year, and I thought I was being a little bit aggressive with the projections last year, but we've seen good numbers in the retail sector and in terms of taxable sales. And think that will hold up, just not quite at the level that it's been at thus far. Looking at 15-16 at the coming fiscal year, I projected 4% statewide growth. Again, that's a lot of the indicators are strong. There's a lot of people are projecting more than that. I know at the state level they're talking, if you look at the consensus, the most recent consensus revenue forecast, they're talking 5.1, 5.2% growth for state sales tax at the statewide level. I guess this just comes down to, for whatever my gut feeling is worth, just a feeling that this really strong sales tax growth that we've seen for the past few months, past few quarters, maybe just can't quite sustain itself at the level that it's been. I don't know that I have anything to point to individually, to say that if you wanted to be more optimistic, if you will, or have different thoughts on what it might mean for you locally, certainly growth could be higher in some places and lower in some places. But overall, I think you're going to see good growth. I mean, there's nothing, 4% is nothing to shake your head at, but just think that what we've seen this year, at least in terms of this 12.4% growth so far and what we expect to see for the full fiscal year, probably won't manifest itself 2 years in a row. I'm looking at the slide. Hopefully you all got the sales tax calculation spreadsheet and the city hold harmless calculator that's on there. I can't take a lot of credit for that. That's left over from my predecessor, Carl Knapp. But we did update that for this year, and so hopefully, when you're looking at your projections and want to project what your city hold harmless payment might be for the coming year, that is a place to do that. And if you have questions about that spreadsheet, let me know. I'm happy to try to walk you through that. But hopefully, you plug in your assumptions, your thoughts on growth rate locally, and it can give you some of the numbers that you need for the coming fiscal year. In terms of change in county distribution, like I said, I can answer more questions about that or tell you more about that if you'd like me to. Obviously, there's been a couple different bills on sales tax reallocation proposed that have already generated a lot of discussion, a lot of questions for me. One of the reasons we're having this now, maybe rather than last week, is because I had to put off the revenue memo a little bit to try to really dive into some of these sales tax reallocation bills and figure out what they mean. I'll stress that everything is in its initial draft. Nothing has passed yet. Nothing has even had a hearing. Nothing has been voted on. So we have a lot of ideas out there. We don't know what they're going to mean for the next fiscal year, for fiscal years down the line. I can go into more detail on that if you'd like me to. Just in the interest of getting through the slides, I'm going to move on right now, but certainly let me know if you have questions or if I can say any more about sales tax reallocation or what I know right now. We'll talk about the Powell bill a little bit. I mentioned the bill that was just passed. My days are blending together, but I guess it was just last week that it received its final approval and was signed by the governor into law. The gas tax that has been 37.5 cents all year was cut as part of that bill, Senate Bill 20, to 36 cents a gallon as of April 1st. So as of last, I guess, Wednesday was when the gas tax dropped. So that is going to cut into your Powell bill a little bit for the coming fiscal year. I projected less than 1%. I mean, we're talking about a 1.5 cent drop in the gas tax for 1 quarter of this current fiscal year. So hopefully it should have a minimal effect on what you see in 15-16 for those distributions. That same bill, I didn't really get into this in the memo because we focused on 14-15, 15-16. That same bill cuts the gas tax to, I believe, I guess it keeps it at 36 cents. If I'm remembering correctly, I think it keeps it at 36 cents through the remainder of this fiscal year, and then down to 35 cents at January 1st. It may be 35 cents on July 1st and 34 cents on January 1st. The details are getting fuzzy to me right now, and I apologize. So we are looking at a little bit more of a decrease in 16-17 if you want to project out that far, just because Powell bill lags gas tax collection. So what you receive in the coming year is based on what's collected this fiscal year. What you receive in 16-17 is based on what the gas tax actually is in 15-16. And as long as municipalities are just receiving 10.4% of gas tax revenues to make up the Powell bill statewide, our PAL bill funds are just going to drop or rise in proportion with the gas tax. Now, when Senate Bill 20 was passed, it was sort of discussed and framed as a way to kind of stabilize things and set the stage for a long-term conversation about transportation funding. There hasn't been a whole lot of in-depth discussion about what that might be or what local funding might look like under some sort of long-term funding solution, but just be aware that we'll be very much involved in those conversations and talk about what they mean for PAL bill. So there is some chance, I guess as there always is, that PAL bill distributions may not look the same or come from the same revenue source in the future as they do right now. But for now, this is what we know, probably less than a 1% reduction next year, and then a little bit more than that going forward if things stay as they are. Senate Bill 20 was passed, of course, because the gas tax was scheduled to drop to about 30 cents, maybe 29 cents and change as of July 1st. So we're talking about minimal reductions the next 2 years. We could have been talking about PAL bill reductions, on the order of 20% statewide. So we do thank the legislature for doing this, and we're big supporters of this effort because we felt the need to stabilize these transportation revenues and not have have such a volatile gas tax and see transportation funding drop so much in the next fiscal year. So that's kind of where we're at on PAL bill. Electricity and natural gas tax is the other one that I wanted to talk about quite a bit. I think most of you know by now that the method for distributing the electricity and natural gas tax changed this most recent fiscal year. I talked about this more in the memo, and I think I talked about it in the memo last year. Fiscal year 13-14 was sort of the end of the old utility franchise tax, and now as of 14-15, we're applying the standard local sales tax rate to sales of electricity and natural gas, and then returning a percentage of those general sales tax rate revenues back to municipalities. In the case of electricity, it's 44% of sales tax revenues. In the case of natural gas, it's 20% of sales tax revenues. And those percentages were chosen by the legislative staff with the intention of holding municipalities harmless. So the idea was that everybody would get approximately what they got in fiscal year 13-14. And if there was extra money in the system, they would be distributed among all cities on an ad valorem basis. If there was less money on the system, everybody would be reduced proportionally to make up for the shortfall in revenues, at least as compared to 13-14. So we've had two distributions for electricity and natural gas sales tax thus far under the new formula, and there's a pretty significant discrepancy from fiscal year 13-14. In the case of electricity, that's quite frankly worked out to the city's benefit. There's more revenue in the system under this new formula than there was under the formula in 13-14. We were up, cities as a whole were up 17% in quarter one over 13-14 levels and up 58% in quarter two over fiscal year 13-14 levels. So, that's a significant increase. Some of that maybe can be, factored into, can be explained by consumption or some other factors, but some of that is likely just due to the formula and the way that it's written. On the flip side of that is natural gas. Natural gas is down, I think I have the memo in front of me, but natural gas has been down. I think it was up in the first quarter and then down almost 50%, about 47% in the second quarter. We've seen some amended returns filed for the past 3 years that have affected these distributions, particularly in the event of natural gas. So, we've been up in electricity and down in natural gas. I wish I had, quite frankly, I wish I had more data to go on. I wish we had more distributions and more of a sense of how much of this was due to some of these amended returns and how much of this was simply due to the way the formula is written in statute. But the best I can say right now is that for fiscal year 2015, we'll end up about 30% for electricity and down about 35% for gas. Of course, we could come out with a third quarter distribution here in the next few months and see that that's that affects the data from the first couple quarters that we've seen. So I would just urge you to keep a close eye on those distributions, see if they're continue to be as different from fiscal year 13-14 as we've seen thus far in 14-15, and we'll certainly be doing the same. Assuming that this holds, that this performance of the formula holds, and nobody decides to go back and revisit the formula as a result of some of these distributions, I think the change in electricity and gas for fiscal year 16 is certainly going to be a lot more minimal, at least as compared as it was to this year. Not that this year is the new baseline. 13-14 is always going to be the baseline, but as long as the formula stays consistent, you would expect the electricity and natural gas revenues to remain relatively consistent. These are two of the revenue sources that are particularly affected by the weather. 13-14 was a cold year and had a lot of natural gas revenue, and so that having that as the baseline year can be difficult when you talk about weather sort of has to match what it was in 13-14 in order for folks to get all the revenue they did in that fiscal year. So just looking at the weather forecast, which is always a dicey proposition, I mean, I don't know that anybody has a really great idea what the weather's going to be like tomorrow, much less 6 or 8 months from now. But if the temperatures stay relatively consistent along with what they predicted, gas revenues will probably drop a little bit, and electricity revenues will continue to increase a little bit. Hopefully nothing as drastic as what we've seen this year, but again, I would just, only having 2 quarters of data to go on is difficult, but I would just continue to watch those next 2 distributions of this to try to continue to get a better handle on what exactly this revenue source is going to do going forward. The other taxes in the chart, all are kind of relatively less revenue as compared to some of the sources that we've talked about thus far. Telecommunications, again, as folks switch over from landlines to being cell phone only, and we see that trend continue, we've seen revenue decrease in that area, so kind of expect that to continue in the next fiscal year. As I mentioned, the solid waste disposal tax, that tipping tax that you pay when you take something to a landfill or a transfer station to go out of state, as long as there's increased construction activity, we've seen that revenue source increase a little bit, and so we're predicting 5.5% this year and 2.5% next year. Local video programming has decreased recently. I think a lot of people attribute that to folks cutting the cable, so to speak, on cable and satellite television and getting all their TV through Netflix or Hulu or Amazon Prime or whatever it is that you use. But we did see a little bit of a trend upwards this year. I don't know exactly what to attribute that to because I don't see any evidence that people are cutting the cord less on cable. Maybe it's plateaued a little bit, but despite an increase this year, I still see a slight decrease coming in the 15-16. On the contrary, beer and wine sales continue to grow. That continues to be a relatively strong point, and so we think those are going to continue to increase by 3% in the coming fiscal year. And I always throw this reminder in there about reporting your boundary changes to the state demographer and sending back your federal boundary and annexation survey as well. Especially to the extent that we're talking about more per capita distributions for sales tax. And again, I'm not saying that is going to happen, is not going to happen, just that's certainly part of the discussion right now. And as long as we're talking about per capita being used more and more, it's certainly more important than ever that your boundaries are accurate, your populations are accurate with the federal government, certainly with the state demographer as well, to making sure that you're getting credit for all the population that you have. So please do report all your boundary changes as well. Kenneth, do you want to talk about the Local Government Budget Association now, or do you want me to do questions first before we get to some of that?
Let's do questions first so that we make sure we use the time we have. So far, I'm looking to see and trying to see if anybody's got any Okay, I got one here, so let me move over. And I know some of y'all are using the questions box. If y'all can use the chat box, it's a little easier for me to see. First question, will the increase in gas tax from 3.5 to 7% have any impact at all? I think you may have covered this, but just verify on that one.
In the natural gas tax, I know
Right.
there were some gas cities, quote unquote, some natural gas cities that are in the natural gas business that were allowed to phase in their sales tax on natural gas from 3.5% last year to 7%, I guess, or I guess 3.5% this year, 7% next year. I'm trying, you know, I don't know how many gas cities there are statewide, 8 or 9, something along those lines.
That's about
you know,
right.
I think it could have a little bit of, I mean, just a little bit of an impact in terms of putting more revenue into the system. But, you know, to the extent that those 9 cities compare with all the natural gas companies around the state, it'll probably be minimal revenue added. So I don't think it'll account for all of the drop and will not, you know, any more. One of the issues, and I meant to mention this, and I apologize for digressing if that's what I'm doing a little bit, but, you know, it used to be that consumption within your boundaries actually played a role in how much of the utility franchise tax you were getting, and that's no longer the case anymore. You know, it's based on your 13-14 distribution, and then all the growth is distributed statewide on an ad valorem basis. And so, you know, even if natural gas revenues increase locally or your consumption increases, the growth you're going to see is going to be based on your ad valorem, you know, your percentage of your property tax levy statewide. It doesn't have a lot to do with your local situation directly. And so, you know, you might not be sharing in the growth the same way that you were in the past if your ad valorem levy is, you know, a lower percentage than kind of your share of consumption was under the old model. So, you know, I do think that tax rate may put a little bit more money into the system, but I don't know that it's going to be enough to materially affect everybody's distribution as a whole.
Okay, the next question involves, will the PowerPoint be available? And it will be. There will be one link that we'll provide everybody later this afternoon that will have the embedded video from this presentation, as well as the PowerPoint and all the attachments that Chris has mentioned that were in a prior email. So everything will be in one post. Are there any other questions that anybody has at this point? You can enter them in the questions field or also in the chat field if you would like. We'll wait just another.
Yeah, I haven't seen any in my email, and not seeing any in the chat box. I guess, you know, just to vamp a little bit while I give you the chance to get in any last questions. You know, I mentioned these legislative issues. You know, we know, I think you've heard from us, these sales tax reallocation proposals are out there. We keep hearing talk about another draft of Senator Brown's Senate Bill 369. We have not seen that yet. The legislature is kind of on spring break this week. There's not going to be any legislative business done, so I don't know if we'll see anything updated on that. Like I said, just staying on our legislative bulletin mailing list, and I'm happy to get you on that if you want to email cnida@nclm.org, I think is the best way to stay up to date on this. And we're certainly heavily involved in those discussions and advocating for solutions that don't necessarily take money from one area and send it out to another. I'm not sure we believe that that's the best method for getting statewide economic growth in all these areas. I mean, we appreciate the senator's concerns and are advocating for solutions ourselves that help rural areas just like they help urban areas, but I don't think we believe that the transferring of revenues from one area to another is necessarily going to solve those problems. You know, you've seen some numbers from me in the Fiscal Research Division. I think regardless of what the numbers say, one overarching concern with all of these plans is that all of the sales tax reallocation plans we've seen thus far repeal your local sales taxes as a locally levied revenue source and transfer them to a state sales tax that is then shared back with cities and towns. So whether you're gaining money or whether my projections differ from fiscal researchers a little bit, I think we're going to remain concerned until we see a bill that keeps that local levy a local revenue source, because you know, we like it as a locally levied revenue, and if it goes into a state revenue that is just a percentage is shared back with municipalities, then you always have the worry that at budget time the state could just adjust those percentages to help their bottom line, even if it would leave cities hanging out there a little bit. So we would just prefer that that option not even be there. It's always a possibility, but to the extent these revenues could remain local, that's going to certainly be our preference, and it's something we've communicated and will continue to communicate. So I'm sort of rambling right now, but I don't see any other questions. Kenneth, unless you've gotten any more, I just want to say thank you all for hanging in there with us. I really appreciate Kenneth setting this up and working through this. I appreciate the opportunity to talk through the memo and everybody's interest in this. I'm always available to answer questions, so please just email me or call me anytime. But thank you to Kenneth, and thank you to the Budget Association for all your time and all your help today. And Kenneth, I'll turn it over to you to go ahead and wrap things up.
Okay. Let me first of all just take this last opportunity to kind of mention, for those of you who are members of the association or who are interested in our summer conference, our summer conference will be July 8th through 10th at Shell Island in Wrightsville. You can see what the registration rates are there, as well as the hotel rooms. We have a very busy conference, a lot of presentations. We do have two key speakers on Wednesday and Friday. Dr. Jim Johnson from the Keenan Flagler School at UNC will be our keynote speaker on Wednesday. He is a well-known demographer and cultural and demographic analyst. And then Lee Roberts from North Carolina, who's director of North Carolina Budget Office, will be our speaker on Friday, as well as we'll have an economic presentation, legislative updates from the League of Municipalities from Chris, as well as from the Association of County Commissioners. You can learn more about this conference as well as membership in NCLGBA at our website, nclgba.org. Just to quickly, if there are any other questions, I want to do one thing real quick, and that's move it over to my screen. And again, thank you all very much for your participation. And again, this session, the video as well as everything else will be made available online later today. And we'll have the link. We'll send it out by the listservs, as well as I'll give it to Chris to send out to the League of Municipalities email. We thank everybody for attending. We thank everybody for their patience. We apologize for the late start and the inconvenience in the setup. We were able to get it to work out. And again, thank you, and have a good rest of the day and week.
Thank you, Kenneth. Thanks, everyone.